It's a case that has us wondering, could we be witnessing the end of international justice as we know it? The acquittal of Ivory Coast former President Laurent Gbagbo on genocide charges, just the latest blow for the International Criminal Court as prosecutors mount an appeal against the ruling, clearing Gbagbo and his former youth wing leader, Charles Blé Goudé. We're going to review the strengths and weaknesses of a 7-year case or in a 2-year trial where judges blasted the prosecution for presenting weak arguments more broadly after the collapse of the case against Kenya's president and others, and the acquittal on appeal earlier this year of former Congolese warlord Jean-Pierre Bemba. What now for the ICC? Can justice be blind at an international level when prosecution before that court can change a nation's political destiny? And then there's the destiny of Ivory Coast itself and its former president. At 73, Laurent Gbagbo remains the uncontested leader of one of that former French colony's 3 main political blocs. In his absence, almost all of those tried for the atrocities committed in the wake of the 2010 presidential poll have been from his own camp. Victor's justice, should he be allowed to run in next year's elections? Would his return stoke tensions or help foster a reconciliation that so far has been deferred? Today in the France 24 debate, after Laurent Gbagbo's trial, with us, France 24's Mark Perlman, who was at The Hague for us earlier this week. Thanks for joining us. Thanks as well to attorney Juan Branco, former special advisor to the ICC, the previous ICC prosecutor, Luis Marinho Ocampo.
Hello.
Welcome to the show. And from London, Apollos Dante, member of Laurent Gbagbo's FPI, the Ivorian Popular Front Party. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
The France 24 debate on Facebook and Twitter, hashtag F24debate. Laurent Gbagbo not out of jail yet. The prosecution and defense arguing over whether he is a flight risk during the appeals process. Erna Gunke takes a look back at a 7-year saga.
When Laurent Gbagbo's trial began on January 28, 2016, it was the first time the International Criminal Court had tried a former head of state. 5 years earlier, Gbagbo was still the Ivorian president, running for re-election. The campaign had been tense. So was Election Day on November 28, 2010. The tension escalated further when the Electoral Commission declared opposition leader Alassane Ouattara as the winner.
Alassane Ouattara got 54.10% of the ballots.
These results were later invalidated by the Constitutional Council, which said Laurent Gbagbo had won the vote. Confusion soon turned violent, and for 5 months, the Ivory Coast descended into chaos. 3,000 people were killed in clashes between the 2 rival camps. That's when critics say Laurent Gbagbo launched a campaign of organized murder, rape, and persecution against his opponents, spearheaded by his right-hand man, Charles Blé Goudé. Gbagbo was arrested by Ouattara's troops in April 2011 and turned over to the ICC to face trial for crimes against humanity, a charge Gbagbo always denied.
Madame la Présidente, Madame et Monsieur les juges, si nous n'employons pas la...
After more than 2 years on trial, Gbagbo's lawyers say none of the evidence proves crimes against humanity. They asked for the former president to be acquitted and released immediately. If Gbagbo regains his freedom, he would walk in his wife Simone's footsteps. The former First Lady was granted amnesty by President Ouattara in August. She was serving 20 years in prison for, quote, attempting to undermine state security.
Mark Perlman, there was this anticipation that he and Charles Blé Goudé could be cleared. When it happened, the judges, unequivocal about how weak they thought the prosecution's case was.
Yes, I mean, it was pretty extraordinary to see the judges really slam the prosecution and the Office of the Chief Prosecutor, saying that it was exceptional that an acquittal would be pronounced even before the defense would present witnesses and evidence, because in this trial, the accusation presented witnesses, 82 of them, then stopped because it was not going well. And the defense last July said, we don't even need to present our witnesses, our evidence. the case is going to collapse. And this is exactly what happened earlier this week when the judges decide that Laurent Gbagbo, Charles Blé Goudé should be acquitted and that there's no reason for them to remain in jail. The prosecutor has appealed that ruling, essentially to say whether they should remain in jail or not until there is an appeal or review on the acquittal decision. But this is really, really a body blow for the office of the prosecutor.
A weak case or a weak prosecution, Juan Brun?
Clearly both. I think what is even more extraordinary is that the defense could have probably gotten Mr. Gbagbo released earlier if it had asked for it. They wanted to make sure that when it would be decided, they would be sure the thing would have happened. But it's probable that 1 year beforehand, already in the process, in the proceedings, it could have happened. So yes, it's a major blow, as you said, and it's a major blow to the prosecution, the current prosecution also, because the current prosecutor of the ICC was the number 2 of the first prosecutor of the ICC. So there's a continuity between the two mandates. And there was a prolongation of the methods and of the strategy of the first prosecutor by this one. So it means that the states, after 9 years of a first prosecutor, decided to go further and to continue with a strategy that was already collapsing the institution.
Why was it collapsing? Tell us about this strategy.
All the important cases of the led by the prosecutor of the ICC have failed. Like clearly there has been a problem in terms of investigation, but also because of lack of courage probably of the institution, that meaning that they tried to invent a new model in which they wouldn't have to go to the field. They would rely on intermediaries. They would rely on people that would be doing their work because they were afraid of consequences of losses of people, of high civil servants, etc. This is the first thing. And the second was like a strategy.
Because their big handicap is they don't have their own police force, they don't have their own FBI or
There's an anecdote
MI5.
that the first investigators that arrived to the ICC, they were coming from the ICTY, and they came with some metal models that were putting their addresses and their identities in the case they would be found dead in the scenes in which they would be investigated because of political pressure, etc. They were ready to take that risk, and the institution took 180 degrees shift policy over these questions in order to make sure there would be no loss, no casualty, no risk taken by the investigators.
Who made that decision?
It was mainly the prosecutor, but with the agreement of the states. And the second problem of the strategy of the prosecution is the complacency with the states in general, and more strongly with the main powers in the international arena. He accepted to play along the agendas of the powerful states in order to have cases that would get into the ICC, in order to try to build the institution through cases. This is, of course, extremely dangerous because you're playing the games that are politically inclined, that are politically biased, in order to feed the institution in a way. Even the terms that I used were used at the institution at the time, in order to at least have some activity that will convince the other states to support you. And this kind of game, of course, collapses when you're confronted to judges, because the judges have to judge on the merits, on the facts, on the law, not on the political strategies or interest of any party. And that is what is happening now, but what happened with Bemba, and what is going to continue to happen if there is not a strong change at the court. All
right. Back in 2010, Mark, you sat down with the then International Criminal Court prosecutor, Luis Marinho Ocampo. Just to set the context, the election had passed, but Gbagbo was still in power, refusing to leave, and the fighting and the atrocities had begun.
One of the important things is to prevent future crime. It's part of a mandate. But that's why the beauty of this institution, few cases send a strong signal to 114 countries. So the Kenya case is a signal. If you produce massive violence during elections, you are not getting a ticket to the government, you're getting a ticket to The Hague. And that's the message. And the message is good for Kenya, it's good for Guinea and Cote d'Ivoire in the short term, and from other countries who are used to have violence to gain power.
Mark, what else did Luis Marinho Ocampo tell you?
Well, he clearly warned Charles Blé Goudé, who was the youth leader at the time, that if he was continuing to incite violence, he would go to The Hague. And so this is actually what happened afterwards. Charles Blé Goudé was arrested years later in Ghana. But this was the way this was functioning. We were in the middle of the crisis, and clearly this was the time when Luis Moreno Ocampo was trying to start building a case. We then learned, because there have been leaks in recent months, that actually he was in close coordination with the French authorities to try to make this happen, especially send Laurent Gbagbo to The Hague. So there is clearly a question mark in terms of the methods that were used, and some of the court insiders, and I'm sure you've heard that story, were saying that the way the evidence was gathered and put together was extremely weak and extremely political at times. And today, the court, at least the office of the prosecutor, is paying that bill.
Apollos Dante, do you, in your view, scrap the International Criminal Court or reform it?
Well, first of all, clearly the international justice need to be, rethink again, because clearly this one is not working. It's not working because at the beginning, at the root cause of it, there's no fairness. There's no equality. I mean, not everyone is equal in front of that international justice, and it can only fail because justice can only be served if it's fair. But what we've seen with the ICC from the beginning is completely biased toward the big nations, the big guns of the world, the powers. And on that scale, African countries, being weak states, the ICC is biased against them. That's what we've seen so far. Most of the, if not all, of people who went in from of that ICC court are mainly from Africa, African leaders. But I'm not saying that African leaders cannot commit crime or haven't committed crime or anything, but clearly they're not the only one in the world who do that. And even that
was the argument put forward by Ivory Coast's current president, Alassane Ouattara, at the time. He said, for a trial like this, for somebody like Laurent Gbagbo, we don't have the means to stage a credible trial here. And that's why they handed him over, he said, to the International Criminal Court.
Well, tell me, which court of justice is credible then? We've seen that, okay, they don't trust the justice court in the Ivory Coast to handle the case, so they took him to the ICC, but now the case is collapsing. Okay, in a way, it's good that they brought Laurent Gbagbo to the International Court of Justice, and in front of the whole world, his innocence has been proven. I mean, so this is good. And sometimes I'm quite amazed when I hear people saying that, oh, justice hasn't been done. So hang on. So for them, doing justice means condemning Gbagbo. I mean, it doesn't make any sense. Justice is about condemning someone who is really, culprit beyond a reasonable doubt, as they say.
Okay, but we have, for instance,
sorry, let me finish that point.
Sure.
Justice is all about when someone has been proven innocent after 82 witnesses. Justice is about letting the person go free.
Now, the case that was brought against him was for covering up or acquiescing in the atrocities committed during that post-electoral period in 2010, 2011. You can still find on YouTube, for instance, those images, those horrible images in one working-class neighborhood of Abidjan, Abobo, of gendarmes gunning down women who were protesting from March 2011. You're saying Laurent Gbagbo is innocent. Has that been proven in this case?
Well, as I said, I'm not saying no one died.
Go ahead.
Okay, thank you. I'm not saying no one died. Obviously, a lot of people died. But what I'm saying is it's been proven after 82 witnesses that it wasn't Laurent Gbagbo who planned the murder. So now let's ask everyone else, so who did it? And, Laurent Gbagbo is not the only politician in the Ivory Coast. At that time, he wasn't even the only one who had an army. He was head of state, so obviously was commanding the regular army of the country. But there were a lot of other armies in the country at that time who were also fighting against Laurent Gbagbo forces. So those ones have never been asked for anything. And it's public knowledge that those armies has committed a lot of crimes. In Abobo, as you were rightly said, they were fighting against the forces loyal to President Gbagbo and anyone else who they believe was close to Laurent Gbagbo.
In this case, though, it was gendarmes who were close to Gbagbo.
Yeah, but no one, I mean, it's been proven at the ICC courts that it wasn't proven, at least, that those gendarmes were, responsible of killing those women. It remains a question. I mean, who killed those women? Are they actually dead? Because there are other reports who also saw that it was all staged. I mean, so this is a complex.
It is a complex issue. I want to ask. Juan Branco about this.
This is my own opinion. This is my own opinion, obviously. But again, when we talk about victims, what about the victims in Diokwe, where forces
sure, and we will talk about
loyal to Ouattara killed at least 1,000 people in one day, followers of Gbagbo. I mean, no one brought those one to justice. So it remains the question of being fair. Justice can only be fair. If it's not fair, then it's not justice anymore.
Right, and we will talk about the Diokwe massacre in part two, because it is important, this concept of victor's justice that has come up so often in the case of Laurent Gbagbo. But your thoughts, Juan Branco, is there closure after the court's ruling that he's not guilty?
I think that's why we should be scandalized by the functioning of the court. It's that the institution in this moment is not allowing to access truth, which is supposed to be the main role of justice, because the investigations are done so poorly, because the people are being so incompetent inside the ICC, and especially out the OTP, but also because this feeling of unfairness provokes the fact that credibility of the decisions, credibility of the facts that are established in front of the court is put into question by all the actors of the... I mean, it makes it not only useless, but even dangerous in a way, because it fuels an opposition between each part. So I think that's why we should hold accountable the people that have been leading this prosecution and their methods, because we're putting... I mean, this institution has intervened into a political process. We have to remember that there was a very hot political process in which the court inserted itself and has disturbed the sovereignty of a country. It can happen, but it has to be justified and it has to be done with extreme caution when you do it. You cannot do it lightly like this and just because they have arrested one of the actors of the conflict, just prosecute this one and then decide that the rest is not that important, or that we will look on it later when Ouattara will leave the power, etc. This is a scandal, and it's very grave because it creates debates as this one, which just torn more and more truth and the political situation in the country.
All right, we're going to pick up on those points when we come back. You're watching the France 24 debate. Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's the France 24 debate. We're looking at the fallout from the acquittal of Ivory Coast former president Laurent Gbagbo and his youth wing leader Charles Blé Goudé on genocide charges. We're talking about it with France 24's Mark Perlman, who's just back from the International Criminal Court in The Hague. Also with us, he's a former special advisor to the ICC prosecutor, Juan Branco. Welcome back. Welcome back to Apollos Dante, member of Laurent Gbagbo's FPI party, the Ivorian Popular Front, who joins us from London. And from Abidjan, correspondent Frank Hersey is with us as well. Just before the break, Apollos Dante talking about the fact that it seems to have been two-speed justice in the wake of the post-electoral violence in Ivory Coast of 8 years ago. The accusations of victor's justice falling on deaf ears. March of 2011, it was mostly pro-Ouattara militias that carried out reprisal killings near the western town of Diokwe, that's near the Liberian border. Estimates of those slaughtered range from the government figure of 152 to 800 or more, according to aid organizations. Frank Hersey, the Diokwe massacre is cited as the example of why there's a feeling that it was two-speed justice or victor's justice.
Yes, that's right. One of the problems that we have seen here in Ivory Coast is that when the prosecutors from the ICC came to investigate, they very much began with investigating the pro-Gbagbo side. And so people feel that there's a sort of injustice there because they came in, looked at they were trying to get, the big hitters very quickly and looked into the pro-Gbagbo side rather than the Ouattara side.
Rather than the Ouattara side, what have been the reactions now since this acquittal?
Well, we've seen a broad range of reactions. Obviously, the pro-Gbagbo supporters have been out on the streets celebrating. It was really a citywide party when we got the acquittal verdict. But then we've also been meeting up with victims of the crisis. And meeting these people, they were devastated because they'd seen a conviction for Gbagbo as their last chance of a real sense of conviction and, for justice. And so they're now fearing that there'll be, things will move on, especially if Gbagbo were to return, things would move on with the reconciliation efforts and that they may be forgotten and left behind.
Mark Perlman, what were the feelings where you were at the Hague?
Well, obviously the Gbagbo camp was very happy. His daughter was there celebrating. His lawyers, his advisors were clearly elated by what happened because obviously this is clearly good news. It was expected because you could see the trial, the prosecution collapsing in the last month. And so this is clearly an important moment. So we're waiting probably tomorrow to have the final verdict, whether they'll be totally free to go wherever they want and where they will go. The assumption is that Laurent Gbagbo will go to Belgium, where his second wife has been based for some time. It's less clear for Charles Blé Goudé. There's also logistical issues that have to be dealt with. For example, passports. In Ivory Coast, passports are valid for 5 years. They've been in jail for longer than that, so probably they don't have valid passports and so on. So there's a lot of questioning, including in Ivory Coast, because the big question is not when they will go to Belgium or to another country, is when they will go back to Ivory Coast. And we've seen the government kind of open the door yesterday, issuing a statement and saying, it's up to them, basically, to decide what they want to do. Just obviously, there is still one obstacle for Laurent Gbagbo. He has been charged last year, 20 years in jail in absentia for a case involving the regional, this West African regional bank and allegedly stealing funds from this. So there would have to be a negotiation, essentially an amnesty for Laurent Gbagbo to be able to go back and not to go back in jail in Ivory Coast, because obviously this would not be his idea.
Apollos Dante, how do you read the reaction of Ivory Coast's government? Is it safe for him to return home?
Well, first of all, it's good that the Ivory Coast government says Laurent Gbagbo can, go back to Ivory Coast if he wants. But at the same time, it's a bit hypocritical because there is clearly this judgment they passed in absentia where they condemned him to 20 years in jail for something which is completely ridiculous. I mean, saying that he stole money from the central bank. But we have to remember that at that time, they tried to starve the country, blocking the banking system. So Laurent Gbagbo, only what he did was to instruct people to even bypass the electronic banking system and then paying the people cash in hand if needed. That was in the midst of the crisis in 2011. So it's not that he took money and ran away with it. So coming back to my point, is the Ivory Coast government has to go to the mile. If they really talk about reconciliation and want reconciliation, and we all think they do, they need, as they did in August, pass another amnesty law to clear Laurent Gbagbo of this completely ridiculous condemnation of 20 years, so that the man can come back to his country as anyone else. I want to make another point on that one. Laurent Gbagbo, when he came on power in the year 2000, at that time, Ouattara, the current president, was in exile in France. there was an international warrant against him issued by the previous government. So when Gbagbo came to power, he said, I mean, for me, Ouattara and President Bédié, who were also in exile at that time, they all have to come back in the Ivory Coast so that we can have like a reconciliation process starting. It did that. So in their turn now, or in Ouattara's turn now, I think it should have the same gesture, like as a gentleman, return the favor to Laurent Gbagbo, allow him to come back to the Ivory Coast, so that as Ivorian, as I'm always saying, we need to put the past behind us, sit down around the table, and really go through a proper reconciliation process, or start a proper reconciliation process. Because up until then,
let's just
it's not possible to have reconciliation if one side is really in exile and not being able to participate in the political life of the Ivory Coast.
Yeah, can Ivory Coast reconcile? Can it turn the page? You still have, and you just heard Apollos Dante mention them, the three big political figures who've dominated Ivorian politics over the last 3 decades. The name of Laurent Gbagbo, known throughout Africa, first as the former school teacher who dared to defy Ivory Coast's founding president. This was back in the days of one-party rule. Sanam Chantier has that story.
It's been 7 years in prison for Laurent Gbagbo, but the struggles of the former Ivory Coast president span over decades. A university professor turned activist who later became an African leader. Now, it was back in 1982 that Gbagbo formed the opposition party, the FPI, before he was exiled in France. This was his first credible political platform. The FPI was later authorized to run in the election. He didn't win, but secured a seat in parliament. In 2000, Gbagbo was proclaimed president after violently disputed polls against his bitter rival Alassane Ouattara.
From this moment, I believe that the transitional government no longer has a purpose. From this moment, I am the head of state.
The early years of Gbagbo's presidency were marked by controversy. In fact, new measures concerning Ivorian nationality fueled anger, leading to an attempted coup against him in 2002.
We are not facing a mutiny, but an attempted coup.
The civil conflict that ensued divided the West African country in two. Amid the decade-long chaos, voting was put off at least 6 times. Then came 2010, when against all odds, Ouattara won the election, which was recognized internationally as free and fair. However, backed by the Constitutional Court, Gbagbo cried foul, leading to bursts of violence between the two camps, leaving some 3,000 people dead and up to 1 million fleeing the fighting. In 2011, pro-Ouattara forces finally swept down from the north and took control of the country, except the capital, Abidjan. And within a month, after an arrest warrant was issued by the ICC, the African leader was arrested. In 2016, the landmark trial of Laurent Gbagbo opened for crimes against humanity.
Frank Hersey, again, these three figures, the current president, Alassane Ouattara, Gbagbo, the former president, Henri Bédié, they still loom large as a presidential election next year. What are Laurent Gbagbo's prospects?
Well, that's a little difficult to discern at the moment because we simply don't know whether he's going to be back in the country. Even if he doesn't return, we expect him still to be very much involved with politics from behind the scenes, from wherever he stays. Because going back to previous mentionings, he is very much ingrained in politics here in Ivory Coast. Now, looking at his FPI party, whilst he's been on detention in The Hague, that's been 7 years now, his FPI party has very much deteriorated, and it's split into separate factions, in fact. Part of them have been the sort of diehard Gbagbo supporters, and they believe he is their sort of eternal president, and they haven't wanted to deal with day-to-day politics, so to speak. Another faction has continued, and it's been standing candidates for election, and they still have a handful of people here. We spoke to them yesterday, and they said that what they're going to have to do now is try and forge alliances with the other political parties, because they very much want to be in the running again in 2020, and they said they're already getting ready as fast as they can in the hope that Gbagbo will return.
And we haven't really gotten to the bottom, and we've been talking about it with our panel, of reconciliation. So can all the issues surrounding the fact that there is an unresolved reconciliation in Ivory Coast just be forgotten?
No, not at all. I mean, this is 8 years on, and it's still very much at the forefront of people's minds. It does feel like a huge rift that is not yet healed in the country. When you when you meet victims here, they have yet to be compensated. There was a minister who very recently said, the Minister for Employment, I should say, Mamadou Touré, said that they found compensation for 2,000 people, and they're going to accelerate this process. But there's a long way to go with that, because people have been forgotten by the state. That's how they feel. They can't find work, and they're even stigmatized against. And so really this reconciliation effort, which means so many different things to different people, it's very hard to define what reconciliation actually is, has been slow going so far. There are hopes that by the Gbagbo side, that Gbagbo returning will mean it will be sort of revived and there'll be a reinvigorated process. And more generally across the population, there is a sort of sense that people do want him back because they want the country as a whole to turn the page and move on.
Juan Branco, what's the international community's role
at a time really like this? It's important because the roots of the conflict of 2010 came from the Marcoussis agreements that were headed by France.
Brokered by France.
Yeah, and France had a very important role in 2010. And so there is an important reflection that has to be brought in by the international powers, and especially by France, on its role in the continuous crisis that had happened in Ivory Coast before intervening, before deciding that they should suggest Ivorians to go to one way or beyond. Now, I think there should be a huge modesty about the continuous interventions in the sovereignty of the country, and maybe understand that maybe now the only thing that the international community should do is foster processes that are already come from the country itself, and not try to impose from the outside a solution to the Ivorian people.
Concretely, how would that work?
Well, it's clearly that, for example, now there must be some pressure on Ouattara government in order to try to go to that dimension, especially regarding, because there is something about I want to recall something. Political responsibility in a crisis is not criminal responsibility, and we've been confusing both on Gbagbo, maybe on the 2010 crisis. And now the question is how to push for a political reconciliation the weight of that is now on the side of Ouattara and not on the side of Gbagbo, which has now, and it comes from little steps, from giving him a passport as soon as possible in order to help him to come back without any preconditions, to the simple fact that the judges have to be conscious at the ICC now in their decision that will come very quickly on the fact that he should be freed or not, that not liberating Gbagbo would again increase tensions, because it would not be understandable by the side of the Ivorian people that are supportive of him, that after a decision that has been so violent against the prosecution and against all these processes, that he would be maintained for any procedural reason.
Let's listen to his wife, Simone Gbagbo, herself amnestied by Ivory Coast government a few months back, insisting his return will help heal the nation.
The Ivory Coast has been on a march towards national reconciliation for a while. Today, I would say a central figure of this national reconciliation has been freed and acquitted. He will now be able to play his part in the entire reconciliation of the nation.
Mark Proman, Laurent Gbagbo comes home. That helps national reconciliation?
Well, first of all, just seeing Simone Gbagbo, let's not forget that there is a case against her at the International Criminal Court. And so it'd be interesting to see whether that case is now being dropped, which is most likely, if her husband...
President Ouattara said he won't hand her over.
Yes, but nevertheless, if she travels, there is an arrest warrant and so on. So that could be one consequence. So clearly, Simone Gbagbo is known not only as the first wife of Laurent Gbagbo, but as a politician and someone who was always described as a very hardline politician. So the fact that there's been amnesty granted to her is a sign that the Ouattara camp is trying to find a way towards a reconciliation. We can imagine that they will maybe want Laurent Gbagbo to come back. However, there's a presidential election coming soon, and there are cracks within the Ouattara camp. His ally Henri Conan-Bédier broke ranks with him, and he actually told me just very recently in an interview that he was actually in negotiations with Laurent Gbagbo to form an alliance against Alassane Ouattara. So, given all the background, given that there are 3,000 deaths with no accountability, no reconciliation, and that there could be yet more political tensions with the same actors that we've had for 20 years in Ivory Coast, there is potential danger behind the nice words and the nice gestures.
Yeah, a quarter century ago, Apollos Dante, it was Gbagbo and Ouattara who were allies against the then president Bédier. Gbagbo at 73 is the youngest of the three. Isn't it time for new leaders in Ivory Coast?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, there are younger politicians in the political system in Ivory Coast, and I could believe that, yes, there is time, or time is coming for those also to emerge. But the point here is really, we need peace and reconciliation, and the three political figures, such as Laurent Gbagbo, Alassane Ouattara, and Henri Conan-Bédier, needs to work together still and bring back that peace and reconciliation in the country, so that the younger generation of politicians coming can, you know, take the country forward. And that is still possible. Today, President Ouattara has that responsibility, toward the Ivorian people, but as well toward the international community that really supported him heavily in 2011. He has that responsibility to deliver now that the country can reach peace and reconciliation. But he hasn't done much so far, and that's quite disappointing. And I think, although within the Ivory Coast, there is no freedom of opinion, or there are still a lot of political prisoners and things like that. There needs to be more pressure on Ouattara really to be more of a peacemaker rather than acting like a winner's side, winner justice. Even simple thing like applying for jobs. It's only people from Ouattara's side that can get job in the Ivory Coast. It doesn't make any sense. All this has to stop. Yeah. And we believe as it was under Gbagbo, that complaint was made against the same thing, and before that, Bédier, same thing. Frank Hersey, one final question for you: when can we expect a changing of the guard? When only God knows. But
let me ask Frank Hersey, our correspondent in Abidjan.
Okay.
And what do you mean by that? A sort of sea change in leadership here?
Yes.
Well, I think it's going to be quite a rocky road up until the 2020 elections, because things were looking more certain until just a couple of months ago. In the last few months here, the whole governing coalition has fallen apart. And especially now, it's very interesting timing with the acquittal of Gbagbo. And at the moment, his FPI party is very much weakened, but I'd say it's a little too soon to work out who's going to be winning just yet. But it feels like all parties, we saw even at the municipal level elections in October, all the parties were suddenly out there fighting to sort of regather their support bases. So it seems very much less certain at the moment.
Frank Hersey and Abidjan, many thanks. I want to thank Apollos Dante for being with us. From London, Juan Branco, Mark Perlman. Stay with us. Media Watch is next. So we say hello to Nicholas Rushworth. Lots of hope for reconciliation, but also a lot of uncertainty about what lies.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. If we look at the local media, one of the outlets to go to is Abidjan.net. It's a portal with information in French. There you can see one of the pieces that's online at the moment, saying that this is what the communique of the government is. And there are 2 or 3 articles more or less rehashing that communique. And the communique is saying, we are thinking of the victims of that crisis, and we are guaranteeing their support. We call on all sides for calm and for forgiveness, and that word you've been raising again and again, reconciliation. So that same website actually has actually a daily look at the press around the country. If we just go to this link, we can see here, there, Le Jour, the front page of one of the papers, Le Jour Plus, and it's saying manifestation de colère against the court. Angry demonstrations against the court in The Hague.
Against the ICC.
Absolutely. In one of the districts of Abidjan, Abobo, yesterday. So that is one way of following the local news. Actually, just the headlines of the different papers. Actually, one of the headlines I wanted to look at was in La Voix, which is the pro-Gbagbo paper, but the site was down for me here in Paris. So there you go. One of the other outlets in Ivory Coast is Fraternité Matin.
Government newspaper.
Yeah, absolutely. But also considered fairly balanced in its coverage. Here, the editorial by Venance Conan is saying that, the quote actually in the opening sentence is, well, politics in the Ivory Coast is a bit like Congolese music. Once you think it's over, it starts up again, it gets louder and stronger, and that is when the political action heats up. So a kind of a warning of a lull, and as Frank Kersey, our correspondent, was saying, that idea that there would be a rocky road to 2020. So the whole question of this now, whether Gbagbo will be going back to Ivory Coast. The comment piece here is saying that, well, this is a difficult pill for the victims to swallow. This will be the problem they face. And also, we're going to see, and we have seen already, the joy of Gbagbo supporters, but does that equal reconciliation? How do you balance that, the image we're seeing of their joy? Let me just go to one of the tweets here of just looking at the supporters. We can see them demonstrating with earlier in the week with Gbagbo freed. That's obviously, we're going to see that in the coming hours, what actually happens. But that tweet there saying, this is a stunning decision. He's acquitted. Rights groups are lamenting. Justice is not being served here. So this is something I saw also in Jeune Afrique, one of the main papers in French which looks at Africa issues. And it's saying that, yes, what we've got now is this decision of him, perhaps himself, deciding how he's going to manage return if the return is on the cards. And their message is he has a 20-year sentence on his head. Negotiations for that will be the main issue. How will that work? And then we've got this whole question of, well, that piece ends saying, arrest him, that is not likely. But the negotiations about his prison sentence, that will be discussed. Let me just finish on this RFI piece. Radio France International has a great website in English, of course, which we know and love. Here, one of its pieces is saying that, well, for the ICC, they take on these complex cases in African countries, but in reality, they can't deliver. They're not delivering. The quote there, the ICC goes after suspects, that's a good thing, but it can't actually pin criminal charges on them. So that debate out there, of course, about the role of the ICC, the International Criminal Court in The Hague.
And there'll be plenty of debate, I suspect, at The Hague over how to proceed the next time around. I want to thank our panel once again. Thank you, Nicholas Rushworth, and thank you for joining us here in the France 24 debate.